Well, good afternoon, everybody. So glad that you all decided to join us here. It's nice to see some folks returning from the morning, but also wonderful to see new faces for the afternoon portion of our day with Dr. Jamar Tisby here at Grace United Methodist Church. On behalf of the congregation, would like to welcome everyone here. Appreciate your patience. We had some book signings that just needed to continue, so we're just a few minutes late, so thank you so much for your patience as we get rolling here. I imagine that almost all of you are familiar with Dr. Tisby, either from this morning's introduction or frankly, that's the reason why you are here. But I will take a moment to introduce Dr. Jamar Tisby to the gathered group. We were saying earlier, just before church, we had the conversation that all of us are on a journey. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the journey that Dr. Tisby has taken in his life. In his relationships, he's a husband and a father. As an adult, he served as a 6th grade teacher in an organization called Teach for America. Perhaps some of you have heard about it. Served for a number of years in that capacity, and then returned to become a middle school principal, and did that for a period of time. He then graduated from Reformed Theological Seminary and earned his PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. Currently, he's serving as a professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky, which is a historically black college founded by black ministers in 1879. He is a prolific speaker and preacher at churches around the country, and I have learned from this morning and through conversations, reading your blog and your books, that his passion is to communicate hard truths about our racial history with clarity, grace, and directness. And for those of you who were here this morning, that certainly was the case as he shared the word with us. His purpose today is to help all of us become lifelong advocates for racial justice. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Jamar Tisby?
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I get to put on my professor hat, so to speak, and speak to you about the threat of white Christian nationalism. And before I get into it, I want you to understand a little bit about why I care about it. So my story in terms of religion begins in high school when I became a Christian through the ministry of a white evangelical youth group. And it was actually quite wonderful in most ways. In high school, you're kind of always looking for your group, You walk into the cafeteria, what table do you sit at? With the athletes, with the skaters, with the drama kids. I felt like I didn't have a table in the high school. Until one of my friends from first period health class invited me to youth group. And it was just great. I mean, you had sports, you had girls, you had food, and then there was this little, sermon message or whatever that you had to sit through to get to the other stuff, right? But so somehow that clicked with me. And on a retreat, I accepted Jesus into my heart, said the sinner's prayer, and it's just this classic evangelical conversion story. But as great as the experience was, there was always a barrier. And for me, that barrier was race. And what was so interesting about that youth group was it wasn't what they did, it's what they didn't do. It's not what they said, it's what they didn't say. It was as if when we went to this youth group and then the church that was attached to it, we were in this bubble where racism didn't exist. The approach was colorblindness, which, I don't know, when I read my Bible, it looked to me like Jesus cured blindness, not celebrate, right? Which is spiritual blindness, not physical, right? So this idea that, well, we just don't see race, we just don't see color, well, it means you don't see me, at least not in my fullness, right? And so race was always part of my religious story, and that was just something I dealt with sort of privately until I got to seminary, and I started speaking publicly about these things. So I formed something called the African American Leadership Initiative at my seminary, because we were in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's black. I mean, it's chocolate city. It's 80% black, which is the second highest percentage of any city over 100,000 people. And yet, when I was in seminary, you could count on one hand the number of black Americans in the student body. And so it was to recruit more black people to the school, also to train people of any race or ethnicity for cross-cultural ministry. So that was public. Then I started something called the Reformed African American Network, as it was known then. It's now called the Witness, a Black Christian Collective, and there's a story behind that too. But I started speaking and writing publicly about race, and the pushback came almost immediately. It was in these very conservative Christian circles that I first learned that neo-Confederates were a thing. People who really wanted the South to rise again, meaning like the pre-Civil War South. It's where I first learned that my job as a teacher in a public school, I was in Caesar's school, and I was corrupting youth because it was a public school and not a Christian school. It was my first exposure to being called all kinds of names. I had a little bit growing up, but I thought we had outgrown childish ways, and it came back roaring. Now, I thought I had seen the worst of what Christians could do around race. And then in June 2015, Donald Trump comes down the escalators of his own building and announces his candidacy for president by saying that Mexicans are sending rapists and criminals over the border. And I, along with many others, were like, you know, my spidey sense is tingling. This may be troublesome for our nation, and especially historically marginalized groups. So I started talking about it online, in articles, and I thought that blend of race and religion brought backlash. There was another component that was even worse: race, religion, politics. And when you add those three together, oh my, watch out. So I started getting this, just being a target of all these attacks online for various reasons. And I knew it had something to do with the political element, but I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it until I was doing some research and I found out that this toxic blend of race, religion, and politics had a name. And that name was white Christian nationalism. So I was looking into this and studying this long before it reached the national headlines. And now it unfortunately has become only more relevant. So what I want to talk to you in our time now is about white Christian nationalism, the threat it poses to both democracy and the church, what it looks like according to some sociological and historical contours, and then I want to talk a little bit about the historical witness of the black Christian tradition as a different way to understand faith and politics, or even simply a different way of understanding what it looks like to follow Jesus. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a better idea of what white Christian nationalism is, why it's so relevant right now and in this presidential election, and then some clues, at least some beginnings, about what to do about it. Sound like a plan? So I joked this morning that I had a super sophisticated definition of righteousness and justice, but that's a little bit more true with white Christian nationalism. But first, let me outline why I think this is important. I've often called white Christian nationalism the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. We stand at a crossroads. As one writer put it, will we be a nation built on homogeneity and hierarchy, or on diversity and equal citizenship. Truly, democracy is on the ballot this year. And I say that as a historian. And let me tell you, it's a lot more fun to study history than to live through it, I'm finding. And we are living through it. What is the difference? What are we choosing this day? Homogeneous versus multiracial. Hierarchical versus equitable. Authoritarian versus democratic. And there's not a whole lot of gray area with the two parties as they currently stand, or the two candidates as they currently stand. These are the choices that we're facing. But not only is this a threat to democracy, this is also a threat to the witness of the church today. As I mentioned in the sermon this morning, to the extent people are leaving the church, leaving Christianity, it is because what they perceive as Christianity is white Christian nationalism. That's what makes the headlines, that's what gets funded, that's what's in these institutions, those are the loudest voices, and they see the hatred, the bigotry, the divisiveness, the hypocrisy, and they say, not for me. And in the most recent polling, the rise of the religious unaffiliated, they're now one of the biggest groups, along with mainline Protestants, evangelical Christians, and Catholics. Matter of fact, they're bigger than each of those groups on their own. It's more than a quarter of the population now identify as nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And so it's a threat to the witness of the church because it violates all kinds of commands. You have no other gods before me. Certainly there's an idolatrous element in some of white Christian nationalism. But what struck me was it's a violation of the third commandment. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Which doesn't mean don't cuss. It means don't do in God's name something God would never condone. White Christian nationalists are doing in God's name acts which God would never condone. So it's a threat to the witness of the church. And I'd say witness of the church because the church will stand. Jesus said, the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. But the witness of the church, we need to pay attention to. So what is white Christian nationalism? This is a maybe dense definition, but I'll do my best to break it down. Yeah, there we go. So here's my definition. There are many out there. White Christian nationalism is an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism as a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. White Christian nationalism is an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. So, it's a lot of words. Let's try to break it down. All right. So now, let's take each of these phrases, ethno-cultural. That is referring to the fact that this is racial. You notice I've been calling it not just Christian nationalism, but what? Now, most of the people you hear in the public are going to say Christian because they don't want to deal head on with the race part, but I'm going to do it. I don't care who's talking about it or how they're talking about it, whether they're critiquing it or whether they're upholding it, the white part is always there. There is an implicit identity being put forth with Christian nationalism, and that identity ain't black. To a major extent, it's not female, it's not disabled, it's not any of those things. The substructure and the subtext of white Christian nationalism is, again, speaking as a historian, the same as it was at the birth of this nation: white, moneyed men. Now, don't get me wrong, quote unquote, not all white people, right? And I love white people. Some of my best friends are white. So, I'm not talking about all of y'all. But as we look, as we will more closely at the hierarchy, who do they want at the apex? And guess what? It ain't po white people either. Never has been. They called the Civil War the rich man's war, the rich white man's war. Anyway, so it's ethnocultural. So you'll hear a lot of talk. They'll try to code it so they won't necessarily say the word white, but they'll say European or Western civilization. You'll hear Western civilization a lot. And the idea is European nations, Italy, Greece, England, France, made the entire world better with their system of government, their cities, their production, their intellectual contributions. Who cares about Asia? Who cares about Africa, South America, all the other peoples of the world? It's really the quote-unquote Western civilization to which the globe owes a debt of gratitude. And so that's the subtext. It's ethno-cultural. Ethnicity, culture, which in the U.S. evinces itself racially as white, moneyed men. Also, it's an ideology. So, have you ever tried to argue with somebody who's like deep down the white Christian nationalism hole? It's like talking to a wall. And I just mean, you can't make any progress generally. Why? Because you're trying to argue on an intellectual level something that is not primarily an intellectual allegiance. It's an ideology. Meaning, it depends a lot more on identity and belonging than facts and data. Listen again. It depends a lot more on identity and belonging than facts and data. See, when you're trying to argue with a white Christian nationalist, you're actually not in a conversation about information. You're in a conversation about who they are and what group they belong to. What's happened with a lot of white Christian nationalists is they've developed a sense of identity. Who am I? And belonging. What group am I part of? So when you're trying to talk to them, what you're trying to do essentially is saying, you need to redefine who you are and come out of who you think you belong to. That's why you can take books and articles, stack them from floor to ceiling, and it won't make a dent. Why? Because you haven't spoken to identity and belonging. Right now, we are tragically in the shadow of yet another school shooting, this time in Georgia. And in the wake of it, finally, I think this is a good thing, people are starting to ask, well, what are we doing with white men and boys who are so often the perpetrators, right? What are they learning about identity and belonging that is malfunctioning to a deadly degree? That's the conversation we need to have as we talk about white Christian nationalism. What kind of identity and what kind of community? And what's going on in our society that folks feel like this is the only place they can find a sense of identity, the only place they can find a sense of belonging? Can we, particularly as the church, offer something better? Here's who you are, and you're defined by Christ. Here's who you belong to, and it's other people following Christ. And it leads us in a direction not toward violence and exclusion, but toward love and embrace. It's an ideology. Next, it uses Christian symbolism. So this is important because a lot of people will ask, well, is white Christian nationalism Christian? Valid question, but I'm wondering about why we ask it. See, if we ask it to answer in the negative, no, it's not Christian, in order to then ignore it, I think we're on a bad path. Because I don't think it's Christian in that it's certainly not the way of Jesus. But it is Christian in that it has all the trappings of Christianity, meaning they use all the same symbols. So, what do? They go to church, they pray, they sing, they wear crosses, they read their Bibles, they call themselves Christian. And if you don't think they're representing your religion faithfully, well, guess whose job it is to represent it more faithfully? See, the people who have the most responsibility to address white Christian nationalism are other Christians. If you think that what they're doing in God's name is wrong, then why are you waiting on someone else from another religion or no religion at all to call it out? So, let's parse the theology, let's look at the fruit, let's call it what it is, but let's not act as if it's not an issue that the church has to deal with. So that's my concern, that's my burden, and so in that sense, I do think it's Christian because it's a problem Christians need to address. But there's a reason why they're bringing religion into it, and it's not to be like Jesus. They're using Christianity as a permission structure. What does that mean? This is language I borrow from Andrew Seidel, who is a lawyer with the Freedom From Religion Foundation. And white Christian nationalism uses Christianity as a permission structure, meaning a cover or permission for its larger and more fundamental task, which is not emulating Jesus, but seeking influence. So in other words, they're going to claim God's divine blessing on what they do. I don't think it's too much to say that this is a new version of the Crusades. You know, the Crusades, hundreds of years ago, the goal was often to conquer lands, acquire resources, gain power, military and political, in God's name. Sounds pretty familiar. The means may differ slightly, but the goals remain pretty consistent. That acquisition. And that's the goal. You need the permission structure because you need some divine reason for your ultimate aims, which is the acquisition of political power and social control. Political power, meaning they want to use the legitimate levers of democracy to get in office and never leave. This is called minority rule, and they perfected it on the plantation. There were never as many white people as there were enslaved. But somehow, the white people had the power. Even though they were in the numerical minority, they set up a system such that black people would have a very difficult, if not impossible, time gaining control. So much of the political pursuit of white Christian nationalism is just that, because by the numbers, they're losing. By the popular vote, they're losing. By polling on certain issues, they're losing, meaning the majority of people want something else. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Just look at the state of Mississippi, where I have 2 degrees from. It has the highest proportion of black people of any state in the country. It's almost 40%. And yet, there is a super majority of Republicans and has been for years, decades. And that push toward political authoritarianism and minority rule, I would argue, is directly proportionate to the number of black and brown people around. The more black and brown people around, the more these particular kinds of people feel threatened, and the more they feel the need to consolidate power and authority. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but you can handle it. You got it. And social control. This is about a hierarchy. So they only want to see certain people in power. This goes back to the white male wealthy person, right? That's at the apex. Then maybe white women in some cases, if you toe the party line. Same with people of color. How can you have black people and Latino people buying into white Christian nationalism? They're not white because it's an ideology. If you buy into the ideology, you're part of it. And you're useful. Because then they can put that black person, that brown-skinned person up front and say, like, see, they're saying the same thing. We can't be racist. Don't you know there were always people in the oppressed class complicit with their oppression? Some of you heard me. All right. So, that's all very technical. But here, folks who are adhering to white Christian nationalist beliefs are not sitting there thinking this is an ethnocultural ideology that uses Christianity as a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. That's not what they're thinking. What they're thinking of is how we all think is in terms of a story. So here's the white Christian nationalist story, which takes all these elements and puts it in a way that makes sense to people. I'll read it to you. It's a lot of text. All right. So it says, America, here, this is the white Christian nationalist story. America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were, quote, traditional Christians, which is the best kind, who based the nation's founding documents on so-called Christian principles, Declaration of Independence, Constitution. The United States is blessed by God, which is why it has been so successful. Of the 180 plus nations in the world, God has specially selected the United States for blessing. And the nation has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But, dun dun dun, these blessings are threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences both inside and outside our borders. That's from Andrew Perry and Samuel Whitehead in their book, Taking America Back for God. And I think it's helpful. Because if you know this story, you're going to start to see how it shows up in our politics and society. Folks think that the United States was uniquely blessed by God, and it was founded as a Christian nation, and it has prospered to have this great military and economic standing to the extent it has followed God's ways, as fundamentalist Christians narrowly define it. But now, America is veering off course and is about to go over a cliff this election. Why? Because of un-American, read also un-Christian influences. Now let's think about who they consider un-American or un-Christian. Black folks, brown folks, immigrants, LGBTQ folks, people who are too loud about justice folks. Everybody except people who believe just like they do. Now, how are you going to have a multiracial, diverse democracy if that is your perspective? You can't. Those are the stakes in the election. And you please be sophisticated in your understanding. Well, first of all, there is a very baseline brutishness here. So one of the major talking points right now on the right is mass deportations. So there is a very real sense in which physically and no doubt violently they would expel these un-American influences. But there's also another sense where you, as learners and people concerned about this nation, need to be sophisticated in your thinking. It's not that the presence of non-white people in and of itself is problematic. The power of non-white people is problematic. That meaning they'll tolerate us as long as we don't rock the boat. So don't expect that they'll go out and immediately say, well, all the black people have to leave. They don't care as long as we don't have power. They don't care as long as we don't make too big of a fuss. They did care in the summer of 2020 with the racial justice, because folk got too loud. And then, you know what? This is just me talking. Their white sons and daughters got involved. And they were at all these Black Lives Matter marches and protests and, saying things need to be changing. Now they got to have these conversations at the dinner table and all that. And this has gotten way too out of control. You know what's going to happen on January 6th, right? Anyway, that's just me. Let me keep going. All right. So we've looked at the deep story. Let's look at some of the data here. So one thing that we need to understand is that white Christian nationalism is not a binary. You either are or you aren't. It exists as a spectrum. So you can hold these beliefs more or less strongly. This is a graph from the Public Religion Research Institute. It's done polling for years on this, and they have worked with sociologists to develop a spectrum of belief. So on one side are Christian nationalism rejectors. They completely disagree with these 5 statements that I'm about to show you that indicate Christian nationalism. They just reject it. Then there's another group called the skeptics. They also disagree with most of what white Christian nationalism would promote, but they're just less likely to completely disagree. So it's a how tightly do you adhere? Both of those mainly lean toward rejecting it. Then on the other side are adherents. These are the people who overwhelmingly either agree or completely agree with what Christian nationalism says. These are the folks who show up on an attempted insurrection. And then there's this other group called sympathizers. They still also mostly agree with white Christian nationalist belief, just don't hold it as tightly. Now the reason why this is important is, number one, we can't simply lump all white Christian nationalists into the same category. There's degrees to this thing, right? The other reason why it's important is because politically, they vote as a bloc. So when we look at white Christian nationalism adherents, the most extreme true believers, that's only about 10% of the population. Just about 10% of the population. Which is not that much. We should be able to win the election, right? No problem. Except sympathizers make up about 20% of the population, and even though they don't hold these Christian nationalist beliefs as tightly, politically they vote identically. So it's not 10% that we're dealing with. It's not even 20% we're dealing with. It's the 30%. Now that 30% just happens to comprise a majority of people who call themselves Republican. So it's all stacked on one side. It's not dispersed among the two parties or a third party. And overwhelmingly, both adherents and sympathizers identify as evangelical Christian. So it's in the church. And they're using religious language. And they're very, very motivated to vote. So even though numerically they're not a majority, they're very active. So that's what we're dealing with. When I say white Christian nationalism, there's some beliefs that go along with it. Here's a sampling, and this is they do some polling on it, and it's, you can say to the extent you agree or disagree with these statements. White Christian nationalists believe the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, like official religion. It's kind of not what the founders had in mind, very specifically. The federal government should advocate Christian values, theocratic principles in some estimates. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. And you know what religion they're talking about. So I think there's an important term that's been helpful to me as we think about white Christian nationalism. What they're promoting is something called Christian privilege. So we live in a multi-religious democracy and a place where you don't have to believe anything at all religiously. But what white Christian nationalists want to do is essentially say the de facto, if not the official state religion is Christianity, and our laws should reflect it whether you are or aren't Christian, whether you're the type of Christian I am or not. They say that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. Again, the unique blessing of the United States over and against all other countries, and that the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. This is a big deal when the Supreme Court ruled that you didn't have to compel prayer in public schools. They just thought everything was on fire if you couldn't pray, or if you don't know the Ten Commandments, or they're not in front of the courthouse, right? That's a sign of the secularization and the degradation of society, and we need to bring prayer back in public schools, and we need to have the Ten Commandments on display so people know how to act right, even though they don't act right, but whatever. So those are sampling of the beliefs. Now at this point, you've all likely heard of Project 2025, right? Just raise your hand if you've heard of that. Great. Because a year ago, even 6 months ago, not many people had heard of it. Shout out to Taraji P. Henson. She shouted it out at, the BET Awards. I said, the Project 2025, look it up. And then people were like, oh, let me see. But it's been there a while. What is it? Well, there's a lot of ways to describe it. According to its own document, the 2025 Presidential Transition Project is the conservative movement's unified effort to be ready for the next conservative administration to govern at 12 noon, January 20th, 2025. In other words, the moment their candidate is sworn in as president, they have a 920-page document to enact on day one that will ultimately enshrine minority rule. So, on page 16 of the document, it says, this book, this agenda, this entire project is a plan to unite the conservative movement and the American people against elite rule and woke culture warriors. They call it the conservative promise, and it represents the best effort of the conservative movement in 2023 and the next conservative president's last opportunity to save our republic. Now, a journalist interpreted it this way. Chapter by chapter, Project 2025 offers a how-to manual for the conversion of our democracy to an authoritarian-style government. It can best be described as an insurrection from within. It is the thunder and lightning before a nation's devastating tornadic storm. That's Project 2025. Now, when you dig into it, what to me sticks out, there's, again, over 900 pages. What they do is essentially go department by department throughout the government saying how they would make it more conservative, which is really how they would make it authoritarian and impervious to the will of the people, impervious to democratic processes like voting to actually change it or get them out. So once they're in, they're not coming out. One of the political theories that explains it, that they're operating on, is called the unitary executive theory. Unitary executive theory. What does that mean? Most power is consolidated in the executive branch, which is headed by the president. What they want to be able to do, what that 900-plus page document is ultimately saying, is we want to concentrate power in the hands of the president, the executive office, And Congress and the legislature and the judicial branch can't do anything about it. It is against the Constitution. They don't care. They don't care. And what they'll do is they'll reinterpret the Constitution to make it fit their objective, right? So what they want to do is essentially make the president's actions impervious to the checks and balances that were intentionally put there at the founding of this nation. One of the things that Project 2025 outlines is making all civil service employees, switching them from their current status to what's called Schedule F status, which means the president can hire and fire at will. Which means you've taken nonpartisan civil servants and made them into instruments of a political arm. So that means he can install his own cronies. So that the stuff that happened in 2020 and the 2021 transition of power, where you had bureaucrat level employees saying, no, 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 this is against the rules, you can chuck those people out. At the county level, at voting and polling stations, you can get rid of those people. Also in the federal government, you can put in people who are friendly to the cause, take out people who aren't, or severely limit their power by defunding them, changing their role, all of that stuff. That would affect tens of thousands of employees. So Project 2025 is related to white Christian nationalism because it's related to this acquisition of political power. And then there's elements of the social control there too. What do they mean by woke culture? Well, we're not going to allow books about racial history that we don't like. We're not going to allow books about different identities that we don't like. So this is what we're up against in white Christian nationalism, in political terms. But there's history. I got to go through some of the history. So, anybody know who that handsome gentleman is? Pope Nicholas V. He signed something called Dum Diversus in the 15th century, which was a letter from the Pope to explorers, and it was part of this whole idea of the doctrine of discovery. Mark Charles and Sung Chan Ra wrote a book called Unsettling Truths, and they go back to these papal decrees and the doctrine of discovery, which essentially says, go out and explore. Any lands that you find where they aren't practicing Christianity, you can take them over, enslave the people, and take their resources, and God's A-okay with that. I mean, this is coming from the Pope. And what it did was serve as cover for colonization. So you can go as far back as the 15th century to get these ideas of white Christian nationalism, because you've got these Europeans saying they're supreme religiously, culturally, militarily, and they can go out into all the world and conquer it in the name of God. That's a long time ago. More recently, I find it so interesting. This was the first election after the Civil War, right? One party has a presidential candidate by the name of Seymour and his vice presidential candidate by the name of Blair. Their motto, their campaign slogan, this is a white man's country, let white men rule. You want to know why black folk vote a certain way? For a certain party? We didn't have a lot of great options throughout our history. I'm going to vote for this party that says this is a white man's country, let white men rule. This is the era of Jim Crow. 1865, 1877, we call that Reconstruction. But you know what was going on during Reconstruction? Was the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. There's this immediate pushback and backlash whenever there's a hint of racial progress. Now that happened through racial terrorist groups like the KKK, but it also happened politically, where there's one party that says the way to win, our path toward victory, is by making America great again. If we could just go back to the way things were before the Civil War, before emancipation, or before desegregation, or whenever. But that was still a long time ago. What about more recently? Well, I can give other examples. Did you know that during desegregation, they had something called the Southern Manifesto, which came out right after Brown v. Board. And that was a roadmap for Southern politicians to defy the Supreme Court's order in Brown v. Board. See, they don't care about the rules if it doesn't serve their purposes. But I also say, when we look at white Christian nationalism and wonder what to do about it, I also say the black Christian tradition is the ecclesiastical rebuttal to white Christian nationalism. So you want to see a different way of engaging faith in politics, you want to see a different way of following Jesus, look at the black church, not because it's the only example, but it's a primary example of a Christian tradition raised in direct opposition to racism and white supremacy and white Christian nationalism. So the black church has its own whole host of issues. But on race, we got a lot to learn from the black church tradition, right? So this is one example. Charles H. Pierce was an AME minister in Florida in the 19th century. He was an abolitionist. He helped bring the AME church down south and into Florida. And one of the things that he said, he was both a pastor and an elected official, he said, a man in this state cannot do his whole duty as a minister except if he but looks out for the political interests of his people. A minister must look out for the political interests of their people. Why? Because for black people, politics was existential. Politics was a matter of life and death. Politics had to do with whether you were enslaved or emancipated. Politics had to do with whether you had the right to vote or not. Politics had to do with whether you could go into certain churches, schools, or lunch counters and eat or be served or not. So how could a pastor faithfully serve their flock if they weren't concerned about the political issues that affected them on a daily basis? Now, by the way, do you think that was just for 19th century pastors? Mike, could you say the same thing today? I don't know. I'm just a historian. What do I know? That's up to you all. Frederick Douglass, he made it plain. So let me set this up for you so you understand this quote. This is in the 19th century, of course. Frederick Douglass, this is 1873, I believe. So he's a well-known abolitionist and speaker at this point. He had just given a speech in Louisville, Kentucky, where he's talking about the state of race relations and politics. There's a big election coming up. Somebody writes to him and asks him, well, what do you think? How should people vote? And Douglass writes back, and the letter's published in a newspaper. And there's more to it than this, but I love this quote. Douglass says, "For the life of me, I cannot see how any honest colored man who has brains enough to put two ideas together can allow himself under the notion of independence to give aid and comfort to the other party," meaning the non-abolitionist party. And then he goes on to say, we're not just mindless political beings who just blindly vote for one party. He says, tell your wants. Hold the party up to its profession. But do your utmost to keep it in power in state and nation. So the reason why I bring this up is because, especially among Christians, we want to play this, neither Republicans or Democrats are really Christian. I can't really get involved. There's a third way. I'm above the fray. Just this, to me, very lukewarm approach to politics. It's this idea, if the candidate or the party doesn't exactly line up with your view of Christianity, then you can't support either one. Or, more often, actually, there's only really true one Christian way to vote. Wink, wink. Everybody knows true Christians vote Republican. I mean, everybody knows, right? Well, that's what's been force-fed like a fire hose for the last 40 plus years since the late 1970s and the rise of the religious right. Through talk radio, now it's YouTube channels, social media channels, Fox News, OANN, all of these channels. This nonstop diet of this is the only way Christians can vote. Frederick Douglass is like, what you talking about? Like, it's clear. I mean, throughout history, you can look at every presidential election especially. There's two ways that our two-party system has traditionally looked to gain power. Either you tell people that your way of life is threatened and we need to go back to a time before all of these people had power and influence, or you have a party that at least verbally says they want to be inclusive and a party of progress. Now, over time, the parties have flip-flopped those positions. So don't let people tell you, well, Republican was the party of Lincoln. First of all, Lincoln had his own racism. Secondly, you want to go that route, let's not talk about the label on the party, let's talk about the party platform. I don't care which label it's under, I need to look at the policies. So Douglass was clear about that. And then one of my favorite historical examples is Miss Fannie Lou Hamer. She was born a poor sharecropper, the 20th of 20 children in 1917 in the Mississippi Delta, which is one of the poorest parts of the entire country. She would have lived and died in obscurity had she not, in 1962, heard a message at her church about voting rights. And then asked for volunteers to go and register to vote. She said, I raised my hand as high as it could go. Thus began her illustrious and dangerous career as a civil rights activist. No sooner had she even attempted to register than she was fired from her job on the plantation. Can you imagine going to try to register to vote and getting fired? And she wasn't just fired, she was kicked off the plantation because if you weren't working there, you couldn't live there. So now she's homeless. And guess what? She wasn't rich. Maybe you got a little bit of savings, investment, a nest egg, or even family and friends who could help. All her friends, all her people were sharecroppers. She's broke. That kind of risk for voting rights, that kind of risk for justice. And then not only that, she was beaten to within an inch of her life at a rural Mississippi jail. That story is tragic. Do you know, just to heap insult to injury, the white police officers forced two black men to beat her. They would have killed the black men had they not done it. She suffered permanent injuries for the rest of her life because of that. But in 1964, she was part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was designed to unseat the unlawful, racist, all-white Mississippi delegation, which had locked black people out of political participation since at least the 1890 Constitution, state constitution. And at that testimony, she ended it by saying, "Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" And I end with that question. Is this America? Because we have to remember two critical truths in this election season. Toward a more perfect union. This is one of the statements in the founding documents. I like this because it is aspirational. We're not perfect. And certainly if you look at the Democratic Party, it's not perfect. But what we are trying to do is move toward something, toward liberty and equality and freedom and justice for all, toward a truly multiracial participatory democracy, stumbling toward a more perfect union, which says the work is always unfinished, but we can always make progress. Let's remember that. Let's not get so caught up in our idealistic lens of this is not the perfect candidate, this is not the perfect party. Guess what? It never will be. But can we move toward a more perfect union? And then lastly, remembering that it's not going to be anyone else who comes and saves the day, but that it is up to we the people. It's not going to be a Harris or a Walls. If you want them in office, guess who has to do it? It's not going to be anyone else at the state level or the local level. If you want them in office, guess who has to do it? No matter who is in office, if you want a certain law or policy, guess who's going to have to make it happen? We, the people. When we look at the word political, it comes from the word polis, the people, the city, comprised of people. So I say that because the burden is not on some party out there, some people over there. The burden is on we, the people. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you, Dr. Tisby. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for what you shared. We're understandably going to come to a time of question and answer.
Yes.
But before we do so, there are a few things that I would like to mention. First of all, I understand, or I have heard tell, that there are introverts in the room. And the thought of standing up and asking a question with a microphone may not be your cup of tea. We understand that. So what we're going to do is, for the folks who are comfortable with microphones, you will have the opportunity to ask your question personally. For folks that just for whatever reason would prefer to write down their question, that can be read by somebody moving around here. So Larry, if you'd be willing to help me to hand out, or if we have ushers, looks like Hope and Jennifer might be willing to serve as ushers here. We have some index cards. If you have a question that you'd like to write down on an index card, go ahead and be prepared to fill that out. Another thing is we also have contact information, and I'll read it before we begin or as we distribute it. What we're hoping will happen today, I'm not going to think that this is the start. We've had people in our community for a long period of time who have been moving things along, but hopefully this is a point that you might be able to mark in your life as a time where you begin to move forward, engaged in helping our community to move away from white Christian nationalism and toward that beloved community that Dr. Tisby laid out. So there's a question which we're going to ask: how can each of us work to overcome racism and work toward beloved community through awareness, relationships, and commitment? It's a good question, isn't it? And so you'll have an option. You can check off one of 4 boxes. I'm interested in personal or group study, such as a book club. I'm interested in intentionally developing more diversity in our relationships. I'm interested in participating in an organization that works to overcome racism, such as NAACP, for example. Doesn't need to be limited there. Or perhaps your own idea. We're going to invite you to put your name down, your email, and your telephone. If we have additional lectures similar to this, or I know we're going to be starting action groups, or I'm hoping that maybe we can find a coffee shop or, even a tavern. This is the Methodist pastor saying this, to get together for book club, right? Where we can begin building relationships, all of us together, to start talking about how we can move toward, kind of like what you said, we're in a process, imperfectly, of moving toward beloved community. So these are being passed out, and we really would encourage you, if you're interested in having conversation with some people who are here today, to talk about these books. I know in our church here at Grace United Methodist, we've had either 2 or 3 sections on the color of compromise. So we have a number of skilled people who have already done a book club on this topic, but we also have additional books that we're looking to start. So please fill this out. We promise we won't spam you. We're trying to build a broader community. We also have a number of study guides for the color of compromise that are available, and those are designed to be a journal to help you to go deeper and take a look at that. Looks like, Larry, you're ready to add something here.
Yes, out in the hallway you'll find some sign-up sheets. If you are interested in doing a study on any of the 3 Dr. Tisby books, just sign with an email address, what time of week or day that you might be interested in. And then we're going to organize some studies around your preferences of books, of time to study, and we can organize that when we find out what the interests are. So there's a sign-up sheet for each one of those books out on the table near where you bought your books.
Thank you, Larry. I think we've given people time to fill some things out. If you would like to ask a question, Dr. Tisby, I'd like to invite you back up to the podium there. If you'd like to ask a question or pass along a question sheet, please feel free to do that. I see a hand right over here. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn off my own mic because I don't want blaring feedback here.
Always blame it on me.
Is this mic hot here? Yeah, it looks like it is. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tracy Foskel. Thank you for speaking today. My history is I went to a Christian college. I became a Christian at 11 and grew up in the evangelical Christian group. And then somewhere in my 40s, I looked around and didn't recognize evangelical Christian, and I started digging into why I didn't belong except for here at Grace, which is a microcosm. What I struggle with is knowing this, trying to understand the psyche of people who have bought into this, including close family members, friends of friends, friends that are no longer friends. How do I speak to them, and what do I say to move the needle? And it's falling on deaf ears because it's like, this is not the faith that I owned. And they're telling me I'm evil and I'm secular and I'm all this. And I'm like, whoa, I'm the person you made fun of in high school because I went to Bible college, right? Do you have any words, any advice of how to kind of crack that shell?
Thank you. That's a really tender topic, right? It's about relationships and community and really the breaking of those or the fraying of those ties, and it can be extremely disruptive. So I just want to speak to the heart element, the grief that's there, the sorrow that's there, the feeling like the Holy Spirit has sent you out into the wilderness and away from all the people and the stuff that you once knew, and the sense of betrayal that came with it. Like you said, you know me. We've had all this time together, and now, all of a sudden, I'm anathema to you? So that's an extremely disruptive thing. So I just want to hold space for that grief. It also might be necessary. Jesus said the wheat and the tares will grow up amongst each other. But not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, is my disciple, which I'm not the one to judge that. But Jesus said, you'll know a tree by its fruit. So all we're doing is looking at the fruit and saying, this doesn't look like the fruit of the Spirit. Love and joy and peace and patience and kindness, and gentleness, self-control. It's not there. And I can't be part of a tree with branches that don't bear good fruit. So that's all you're saying. So then you're saying, well, how do I help them to see that? How do I help maybe bring them out of that? There's good and bad news. The good news is you can't, and the bad news is you can't. Jesus can. Yes. Only Jesus can. I found it fruitful to think of these folks as if, I'm not saying they are, but as if they're not Christian. Because so much of what we understand of what it means to follow Christ, they're not doing. Matter of fact, they're doing the opposite, right? So maybe we have to let ourselves act as if, and again, we don't know, but acting as if they don't know the same Savior we do. So then that actually is good news, because number one, when you know you're talking to someone who's completely different, you know there's a certain way to approach that person. And I think what's so painful is we approach white Christian nationalists with the belief that we're on common ground, and we aren't. We're not. So I think that little sort of mental shift, even the heart shift, which means we're going to pray for those folks, right? I'll say two more quick things. One, your most persuasive tool is your living witness. It's how you live. When they see you loving your neighbor as yourself, when they see you exercising compassion and grace, first toward yourself, we always forget that part, and then toward others, there's something, it'll either be the aroma of life or the stench of death, as the Bible says. It's gonna hit people differently, but it will hit some people as the aroma of life, and they're gonna say, they're gonna want to know more. So it's your living witness that is most powerful. Secondly, there are resources, a growing number of resources. So I'll refer you to Caleb Campbell and his book, Disarming Leviathan. Caleb Campbell, Disarming Leviathan. I did a podcast interview with him. If you look up Footnotes podcast, Footnotes with Jamar Tisby, you can listen to him, and then I promise you're going to want to get the book. There's another one coming out called Disciples of White Jesus. Disciples of White Jesus. That's by Angela Denker, D-E-N-K-E-R, D-E-N-K-E-R. What she's looking at is that white men and boys discipleship thing. What is going wrong with young white boys that they're getting caught up in some of this toxic ideology? The last thing I'll say is a resource online called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. CACN, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. They got a bunch of podcasts, PDF handouts, Bible studies, all of that.
Thank you, and I do think it's worth mentioning that while the signups are all for your books, down the road I do plan to have a study on the text Disarming Leviathan, really written for how do you relate to a person that you know well or as a family member. How do you relate and engage with a person, where we take that cue of Jesus told us to love our enemies, and sometimes folks that we feel like are our enemies now, sometimes are in our very same family. Great question. Larry, why don't we go to your side and get a
Surely,
question?
we have a question submitted. What is an appropriate age range to teach children about race to promote a more inclusive society? And a follow-up then as well. As a former teacher in public education, what role should educators play in education around race?
Thank you. To the first question, what age is appropriate? As early as possible in the age-appropriate way, right? So, as children get older, they can handle more complex ideas and concepts. So a 3 or 4-year-old is not the one you want to unpack white Christian nationalism to. But I think from the earliest of ages, you start to instill the idea that diversity is good. See, I grew up in a town north of Chicago, a blue-collar harbor town on Lake Michigan, and my friend group was Spanish speakers, Filipinos, white, black, other people, and it never occurred to me that that kind of diversity was a bad thing. So, some of y'all, depending on your life stage, might have to make hard choices that go against your culture and tradition, because you got to put your children in the way of diversity, especially if they're white, because you can grow up in a very homogenous environment. And so that means what neighborhoods you live in, what schools you go to, Where do you recreate? Where do you go to church? All of those things matter, right? Teaching them the value of that. One of the fun ways to do it, I think the film Zootopia is a fun one to just start a conversation, because every like animal group has its own prejudices and proclivities and whatnot, and that you can kind of use that as a springboard to talk about human difference and the ways people get along. I think they're making a second one right now. Should be really interesting. I really think in-person experiences are powerful. So visiting places, going to a statue, going to the site of a history, it makes it tangible. Adults need this too, but especially younger folks need something tangible rather than just words, either verbally or on a page. So as much as you can make it a tactile, visible experience that's a whole body, mind, soul thing, that'll stick with them better. So plan a pilgrimage somewhere, right? Doesn't have to be your whole trip or vacation, but stop by somewhere. Their museums are doing a really fantastic job. They're not just dry, dusty old history anymore. It's very, very compelling stuff. So that part. There was a second part.
What role should educators play?
Yeah. So, I mean, in public education, obviously you're curtailed in sort of the religious speak you can do. And I also recognize the pressure of the standardized test. At least when I was a teacher, like, you had to run through the curriculum. You couldn't pause to talk about anything in depth, really, let alone racial justice, racial history. So I think actually there's going to have to be, number one, teaching is a very white female profession still, which ain't a knock, but you got to understand the social location you're coming from. So when I was a principal and I hired teachers, the problem wasn't they were talking too much about racial justice, is they didn't have a clue about it. They come from white neighborhoods, white colleges, white everything, and now you're trying to teach about racial justice, whether to white kids or black kids or Latino kids or whoever. You don't have the background knowledge. So a lot of it is training and equipping the teachers, which is also getting harder because of the war against DEI stuff. So I actually think it's going to actually happen through a lot of churches and community organizations. So we have to think in terms of like freedom school mentality, where if it wasn't coming through the traditional public education system, you had to get creative and make sure they got it in summer camps or day camps or church groups or whatever. So it's going to be up to you, the people, to say, you know, number one, going to the school and saying, can I see how y'all are addressing issues of race and diversity? You want to see an administrator get real nervous real quickly, right? And then you know, what's on paper in the curriculum, what are their policies for, you know, if there's a racial incident, like you as community members, parents, family can hold them accountable. Two, getting creative about, well, how can we bring in libraries, churches, nonprofits to also help supplement this education?
Thank you. I'll take a question from the middle section if we have one here. Right back there, sir.
Hello, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Gabriel Lawson. I'm a Catholic school teacher at Chaminade Julian. It's a high school down the road. And, you know, we talk a lot about Christianity in our world religions classes. And your lecture reminded me a lot of a quote by Assata Shakur, who says that nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who are oppressing them. And in our shared Christian faith, Christ compels us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And I think of these two ideas in tandem when I think and talk and teach about white Christian nationalism. So my question is there a way that humility, empathy, and a Christ-conscious living pattern can be convincing by the example that we set, that white Christian nationalism is not a path that Christians should want to go down? Or are there more direct methods that are needed to be taken by witness-appreciating Christians who want to dissemble and agitate against white Christian nationalism? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all,
Softball there
thank you.
for you.
Most of my education was Catholic schooling, K through 8, and then college. And you have a rich body of resources in Catholic social teaching and the Catholic social tradition. So there's a lot that's already written. And that tends to be the case, right? In a lot of our religious traditions, what's on paper sound real, real good. And it's a matter of applying those principles more faithfully. So I actually don't think you have to invent much or create much. Maybe you tailor the messaging, right, to the age and the stage. But there's already a lot there. There's also already a lot in the Bible. How about that? Yes. Online, you see a lot of people, and I don't actually think there's a dichotomy here, but online you'll see a lot of people say, well, why do you want the 10 Commandments in front of all these buildings and not the Beatitudes? Right? I actually don't think they're contradictory at all, but you get the point. You know, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those kinds of things. So I actually think unpacking that for this generation is truly, truly powerful. Now, we are in a time where I think, you know, I started a brand called Justice Takes Sides. So what I do think is important, particularly for, well, actually for the whole church, particularly in politics, is that we do see, you know, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, neutrality never helps the oppressed. It only helps the oppressor. So to be neutral in situations of injustice is actually to tacitly support injustice. So I do think we need to teach our young people that justice takes sides. Why do I say that? Because as far as I've looked, in every historical example and I think contemporary example, when it's a matter of justice, you are not dealing with two equal sides. Typically, you're dealing with an empowered and a disempowered. Empowered meaning they've got the money, the politics, and the military. The disempowered meaning they've got rocks and bottles. For example, right? So I do think it is imperative for us to say that what got Martin Luther King Jr. killed was not on both sides. It was him taking a side. Right? Throughout history, we see that. So that's what I think we need to teach all of us, and especially our young people.
We have another question that was submitted. Can you speak to the issue of debunking race as a false construct? You mean like we're all one human race, that sort of thing, right? And what can we do to challenge the use of race as a demographic category?
The way I think of it is that race is a social construct with real consequences. So race isn't real in several senses. Biologically, we're 99% the same as human beings. Literally, when you talk about race, phenotypically, you're talking about the amount of melanin in skin. Which I actually saw this graphic that sunscreen is essentially artificial melanin to keep white people safe from the sun. So, I mean, biologically, race makes no sense. It makes even less sense in the context of the United States because of all the interracial, much of which was forced on black women by white men. So interesting, right? These laws against miscegenation, and yet it was these white men who were breaking that law all the time. So it makes no sense biologically. It makes no sense theologically, right? That we're all part of the human race, if you will, and God doesn't consider, as a matter of fact, God celebrates your ethnic and national identity because God says in Revelation that people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, God doesn't erase those differences. Celebrates and redeems those differences. So it doesn't make race doesn't make sense theologically. So race is a social construct, namely created beginning in the 15th century with things like the doctrine of discovery, where you're starting to categorize human beings in relation to European explorers and colonizers, perpetuated because of the financial aspect here. Understand that the primary issue of race is not one person not liking another person because of the way they look. That's a byproduct. The main thing was, you got land I want, or you've got labor I want. Therefore, I'm superior to you, and I can demand it. You get it? So what I say in The Color of Compromise, a lot of people say slavery was America's original sin. I said slavery is America's original symptom, and the original sin was greed. Right? So it's that exploitation. So long answer shorter. Race is made up, but it has real consequences. So we're in no sense post-racial. So to me, and others differ, but to me it doesn't make sense not to use racial terms because race still applies, right? And there's the argument that until we stop using racial terms, then, racism is always going to be a problem. I don't think that's how you do it. I think you got to name it, deconstruct it, and then maybe one day we'll get to a place. But the reality is, at least for black people, because of the way race has forced us into community, we've actually developed culture around blackness. So I don't not want to be black, right? That's just me. So I think it's a lot more complicated because it's been around so long. There's actually been cultures and patterns of living that are not entirely unhealthy, at least for black folks and minoritized folks, that we want to hold on to.
Does that answer your question? Is that okay?
Now, for white people, it's different. White
Go ahead,
people,
Larry.
I think you need
I'll
to
get the next
reclaim
one.
your ethnic and national identities over and above a racial identity. Because to the extent you claim whiteness, you're also implicitly claiming anti-blackness, because whiteness can only exist in contradistinction in relation to and superiority over blackness. That's how it was constructed. So the tighter you cling to whiteness, even if you don't mean to, the tighter you cling to anti-blackness and everything else that comes with it. So what's the solution? It's not to pretend as if you're not white socially speaking, because you're still going to have that privilege wherever you go. So don't forget that. But also understand that your people had an identity before they were white. So at some point you were German, you were British, you were French, you were Italian, you were whatever. So I think broadening your identity beyond the racial category of white will help white people get a different perspective, because heck, your people might have been oppressed sometime in your history. Maybe you can identify with that, which will help you identify with the suffering going on right now. Which, by the way, don't use that to say, well, my people suffered too, I know just what you're going through. No, you don't. No. Don't take it that far. But you get what I'm saying.
I have a question on that side.
Good afternoon. I'm a real pleasure to be here. Right now, where we are in our society and in our culture, we as African Americans, particularly our young men, are very angry and frightened of what our future might be. How do we, as older African Americans, what do we say to our young people so that they understand at this particular time the democracy of the United States is at risk? How do we get that through to our young people so that they say, okay, I still don't like what's going on, but I understand what my role is and what I have to do to make what we're dealing with better. I, like you, had a Catholic education with all white people in the room, nobody but me. And it was not fun, it was not good, but I got a good basic education. And the thing that I learned to think like they think. How do we get our young people to face that so that we can continue to progress? Because if we don't, we're going to be, I keep telling my friends, I'm from Chicago as well, I tell my friends, Mr. Trump wants to be like Hitler, and we're going to be the Jews. We need to fix this so that we as a people can move forward.
That's good. That's good. First of all, thank you for the ways that you paved the way for people like me, just by surviving. Yes. That's what burdens me so much when you talk about young people not understanding it, being angry because they don't know what you went through, being the only one in your classroom or your neighborhood or wherever it was, and the things that the way you had to pray, talk to yourself every day to get you through. So for me, I'll use my framework from How to Fight Racism, the arc of racial justice: awareness, relationships, commitment. Arc: awareness, relationships, commitment. So one of the primary things I can do that I think we need to do with our young people is make them more aware of our history. They don't know. They don't know it. Did you hear during the Black Lives Matter protests, both in 2015 to 2017 as well as in 2020, there would be some T-shirts or signs saying, "This is not your grandmother's civil rights movement," which to me was so insulting. Because do you know what our grandparents went through in the civil rights movement? It's even more dangerous than what folks now are facing, right? So there's an anemic understanding of history. And I do find that when we tell the stories in a compelling way, young people are not going to sit up here and listen to Dr. Tisby lecture. But if you can do videos, if you can do quotes, if you can do memes, if you can reach them in a medium that they're familiar with, those stories do still have value and hold weight with them. So awareness is one. Relationships is another, of getting particularly young black men in healthy groups with other young black men, led and guided by some folks with experience, right? So I think part of what's happening is young people are sort of left to their own devices and create their own realities that is very separate from the actual historical or present day reality. So how can we get them in vital community with other people who can help them see it? So it is very relational, right? It's not like you sit them down, have them read a book, and the light bulb's going to come on. Maybe more often it's relational, right? So how can we actually facilitate and structure groups like that would be the challenge. Then lastly is commitment, which doesn't just mean staying the course, but really a commitment to systemic and institutional change, knowing that it's not just interpersonal attitudes at play here, but structural factors are creating inequality. And so I would start local there, right? What initiatives or policies at the city level or the state level, because the problem is with politics, we only look at the national level, right? When people think about they jump immediately to the White House. They skip over the local and the state level. So they feel like voting doesn't do anything because no matter who's in office, their everyday life is the same. So if we can bring the policy closer to home, then they can see, oh, it was only 67 votes that passed this policy for good or bad, right? Your vote is part of that. Or, bringing in the historical piece. The reason why you're able to do X, Y, Z at your school and learn this or whatever is because of this movement that came before you, and we're still in that movement now. So awareness, relationships, commitment as a start.
Thank you. Next question is over here.
Okay, part of history is that the church sort of became part of the empire back in the Roman times and has somewhat continued to do that, so that although we hear Jesus, we read about Jesus in the Beatitudes and Matthew 25 and all that, in fact what's dominant is power and us against them. If African Americans have racial justice, then Euro Americans won't, and so we better accommodate to power. And that seems to be what's happening a lot. What is your suggestions about how, particularly churches, but also people in general, can deal with that problem?
Keep the mic, just state the problem one more time.
I'd say that people may read about Jesus, but the church history is that it's more about also power, accommodating to power, and us against them for what resources that they are.
That's good. I mean, look at the metaphors that Jesus uses to describe the church. A mustard seed, yeast or leaven, a remnant. So I think we need to look in the church, look for the church in the places that aren't the centers of power. The church is often on the margins, the true church. And I actually think that's empowering, because one of the frustrations that I think we heap on ourselves is feeling like not enough people get it. Well, the majority have never gotten it. They've never been a majority. It's always been a faithful minority, right? It's always been the little sprinkle of salt, right? Or the little leaven, right? Or the little mustard seed that has an outsized influence. So if we're waiting around for a majority of people to sort of get on the racial justice train or the journey of justice or whatever it might be, you're going to be waiting forever. You only need a few. And again, I just think, okay, so number one, how do we get folks? What's the problem? We're dealing with a lot of pastors who are held hostage by their congregations. They will not preach what's on their heart or what's in the Bible because somebody's going to get mad, and namely, they'll get mad enough to take the money away. They're trying to keep the lights on. They're trying to keep butts in seats. So you can only go so far and no further. So we actually need pastors, church leaders, teachers with the courage to go there. Especially now. We got, 60-some days to the election? 59? Oh, Lord. That just made it a whole lot heavier. But the time is long overdue. And I'm talking about black folk and white folk too, right? So we got a lot of black church leaders also in that boat. What I'm seeing is in the effort to grow, size, we are not going to go toward the quote-unquote controversial topics. But what did you say? I'm not partisan, but I'm very political. I think pastors need to be nonpartisan, but very political. And if you want, historical, just go Charles H. Pierce, show them that quote. You can't do your duty, but you look out for the political interests of your people, right? So I think the boldness in the pulpit is one of those things. Another one, and this goes beyond the church, but what's really happening is they get caught up in this informational ecosystem that is a reality distortion vehicle. You know what I'm talking about? They get a nonstop stream of misinformation and disinformation that inoculates them against truth. Because they'll take a little bit of truth, distort it, so that you can't talk to them about justice or about critical race theory or about even the way of Jesus. They'll always have a response and a rebuttal. I wrote an article on my Substack, by the way. That's another way that's really, really helpful if you want to support my work. JamarTisby.substack.com. I give multiple articles weekly around racial justice, history, all that. You don't have to wait another 2-3 years for the next book. JamarTisby.substack.com. I wrote a Substack called The People Who Don't Have Any Questions. That, to me, describes many evangelicals. They got an answer for everything. They've gone through every question, every objection, and answered and responded and can check every box. And so there's no curiosity, there's no mystery, there's no room for variation. They've answered every question. And when you're dealing with that, it's hard to change. because they don't see a need to. So the question becomes, how do you penetrate that informational ecosystem? And that's just very hard work.
With your last statement, it reminded me of the fact that many times there's that statement that says separation of church and state. But with everything that I've heard today, because I had never heard about the white Christian nationalism, I can see it as you're describing it. Now I can put a term to it. But if on one hand we're saying separation of church and state, but yet we're advocating this kind of faux religion within political parties, how is that a separation?
Yeah.
Or do they even understand their own?
There's a couple of things there. Separation of your church and the state. But my church and the state can be hand in hand, is one aspect that's going on there. Separation for thee, but not for me. Another thing is, it says separation of church and state, but not the separation of faith and politics. In other words, one of the things I think is helpful is to understand that the separation of church and state really refers to disestablishment and not establishing any one particular religion as the state religion, which in the 1770s and 80s, when these founding documents were being established, you had the Church of England, right, the official church. And so they're trying to decouple the idea that in order to be a full citizen, you had to practice this particular religion. That is separation of church and state in a classic sense. But what people on the right will often accuse folks who are pushing back against white Christian nationalism, they'll accuse them of saying, well, you don't want us to bring our faith into politics. That's actually not true. Bring your full self. Because saying your faith in politics, your values and your politics, right? Obviously, your values are supposed to inform what policies, politicians you support. So it's not that you can't talk about religion in the public square, or you can't be convinced because of your religion to vote a certain way. We're just saying that it shouldn't privilege one religion over another. So, you know, there's a hypocrisy going on there that obviously they're fine with their own version of fundamentalist Christianity being tight with the state. They're not fine with your version of Christianity or some other religion.
And I think just in the interest of time, I have a feeling that Dr. Tisby will be up there answering questions as long as we'd like to ask them.
Which is great. Y'all are so great.
However, I know you also want to have, and we also want to have some books signed, and I know that people also have a schedule to keep. So let's get a final question here, and then we'll move on for some concluding remarks.
Well, I guess the pressure is on now.
Better be a good one.
Well, I will try not to be too long. My question is about, like, other people's beliefs. I'm a nice guy. I like to make a lot of friends if I can. And as I'm making friends wherever I go, trying to be a prime example of my faith and beliefs, I've noticed other people have, like, different beliefs and stuff. And I'm friendly, and I don't like to push my beliefs on other people. But as other people have different beliefs, it can really clash with how I feel and, like, how I want to care for people, because I got a big heart. I love any and everybody who's willing to just be with me, be around me. Do you think it's okay to let other people just go and have their own beliefs, even if you don't necessarily agree with them?
That's great. By other beliefs, do you mean like they're Buddhist and you're Christian, or political beliefs that you feel like are, you know, dehumanizing to other people?
Just in general, it can be about, like, you know, maybe they're like Muslim, or they just don't believe in the word at all. Maybe they just have different belief on how to treat people, how they go about their life, and maybe you just don't think that's gonna lead them to the right place in life.
I mean, here's what I'm increasingly coming to believe, that what we really owe each other is honesty. We can't compel belief. You ever been in a relationship with somebody who is self-destructive? You cannot force them to get healthy. The only thing you can do is be honest. Gracious in your honesty, but honest. What does that mean? You say what you believe and why you believe it. That shouldn't be controversial in and of itself, right? You state your boundaries. This is what's healthy for me. If we go beyond that, if we break that, it's not something I can do. It's nothing personal. I just know what I need, right? So, and in a real way, I think that's very Christian. I think that's what Jesus is modeling. Jesus was absolutely honest about who he was and what he came to do. And people reacted how they reacted. The woman with a discharge of blood said, if I can only touch the hem of his cloak, I'll be healed. The Pharisees said, crucify him. And we don't have control over that response at all. But they cannot accept you or reject you based on a lie. If they are going to reject you, let it be for the truth of who you are. If they are going to accept you, let it be for the truth of who you are. And that's all we can give each other, and that's the minimum that we owe each other.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
A few concluding remarks. We do have books available for sale that are out in the hallway. You just kind of head down several of those steps. And, pardon me? Very few are remaining. And hopefully this was a justice response. Earlier, we had people in line for book signing, and I had to end that signing. There were 9 people. You know who you are. Those are our first 9 folks in line. So the table where Dr. Tisby is right at the beginning of a hallway. We're going to reform that line, the first 9, and people after that. We have our What Do We Do Now? I'd like to encourage you to pass those to the outside aisles so that we could collect those. If you haven't filled one out, you have another opportunity to do one. I really would hope that there would be a number of us who don't want this conversation to end today. Maybe you're looking for additional folks to have some conversation from perhaps different perspectives than you. Let's go ahead and turn those in. Like I said, we promise we won't spam you, but if it's stuff related to what's going on today, we want to make sure about additional opportunities that are available.
We want to help to connect you.
Thank you. We want to help to connect you and build up that beloved community. Again, let's give a final thank you to Dr. Tisby for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and the knowledge that you have acquired over the years. I hope you have had a wonderful day at Grace United Methodist Church. Again, it's for sale. Take care. We'll see you around.